We're joined by our senior counsel for global affairs, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Mr. Secretary, well, the world I haven't talked to you in a couple of weeks because I've been traveling, but we've talked offline, but not on air. The world has changed a lot in the last 2 weeks, to say the least. So you tweeted out that Prime Minister Macron just simply got it wrong. He botched it, and he's now kowtowing to the CCP, and it's going to provoke more aggression. First of all, let's summarize for people. How did you deal with the differential on China deployment and really diplomacy with China when you were the Secretary of State versus what is going on now?
Well, it was remarkable to watch President Macron travel, spend 3 full days in China, and then get back on his airplane and say, France needs to keep its distance from America, and we have friends in China. That is absolutely galling. It is absolutely also ignorant, and I don't mean unintelligent. I mean ignorant. It fails to grasp the central threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the people of France, in addition to those of us here. And for him then to say, gosh, this Taiwan thing, nothing to see here, folks, is an enormous propaganda victory for Xi Jinping. We dealt with it differently. We reminded them of their responsibility, whether it was President Trump and I telling the Germans you can't rely on Russian energy, whether it was us telling the French, no, you have to have a set of trade relationships with the West that are fair and equitable. We didn't live in a fantasy world, Jay. We lived in the world that was real. And what President Macron did there, and apparently with no pushback from the Biden administration, he went and kowtowed to the Chinese Communist Party, distanced himself from America, probably to benefit French businesses. The administration should be all over the leadership in France, making it very clear to them that is an unacceptable position for him to take, and frankly, that he's out of step with many of his European counterparts as well.
In that regard, and I wanted to go to Andy Economo, our senior counsel. We have an office in Strasbourg, France, and we have been in Europe for many, many decades now, back to the 90s. And I have seen just over the last, Andy, I would say 10 years, just to follow up what Mike was saying, this kind of shift. I wouldn't call it anti-America, but they are clearly realigning politically.
Well, this is the thing. You cannot count on the French as allies. I'm afraid you can't. Look at what happened in World War II. Churchill tried to give them a backbone. They don't have one. They made their separate peace with Germany under Marshal Pétain and established a separate country in collaboration with the Germans at Vichy. So do not count on them to support you. As Secretary Pompeo said, a terrible realignment, but something consistent with anybody who reads history.
So we've got China cozying up with Russia, Iran, and others. We've now got Saudi Arabia, China, and Iran. They were about to sign the Abraham Accords, and they were already in a helpful dialogue, and more than dialogue, cooperation with the Israelis. It seems like this administration is taking apart all of the unbelievable work you did to stabilize. Let's first talk about the Middle East.
It is remarkable, Jay, that in just 26 months, I think it is now.
Right.
In 26 months, we've gone from having a more prosperous, more stable Middle East, countries recognizing the right of Israel to exist, and close relationships between the United States and the Gulf Arab states and the United States and Israel, an Iran that was as isolated as ever at any time in history, to now a deep distrust from, frankly, every Middle Eastern country, including Israel, that doesn't believe they can count on the United States of America in times of trouble. And you know this, Jay. If you're the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or the Kuwaitis or the Omanis, and you don't have confidence that the United States of America will be there when you need them, you're going to hedge your bets. So you're going to cozy up to the Chinese Communist Party. You're going to cozy up to the Iranians, try and take down tension. You'll do business with the Russians to try and reduce risk, right? We've got Russians on the ground in Syria. This is what happens with failed American leadership. It's not a singular problem. It is a cascading series of crises that the world now faces as a result of failed American leadership.
So Macron made those statements, and there was some European pushback pretty swiftly. But he had to be calculating on what he was saying, Mike. I mean, for Macron to make that statement, I just, you know what just flashed in my mind? I remember, and I know you were there, so was I, the state dinner that President Trump and the First Lady had for Macron at the White House. I think it was probably 2018 or so. And, the normal flair and pomp and circumstance, the whole event. But there looked like there was really constructive discussion about the kind of how we view the global threats. It seems like now France is really peeling off from that. It's kind of backing up what Andy said. They're going their own way here. They got some European pushback, but they're clearly setting in another direction. So
Andy's comments are certainly right as a historical matter. The French have, de Gaulle withdraws from NATO, right? So there is a long history of French resentment for American power. Second, we also had challenges with Macron too that we worked our way through. You should no one can forget he wanted to stay in the JCPOA, and he pressed me personally and the administration more broadly. Hey, you got to stay in this thing. We got to do this. This was protecting French businesses more than anything else. But we managed our way through it, and this administration has literally refused to work with governments who will have a view that is different than ours and make sure that the American position was understood in those capitals in ways that said, if you don't get this right, there are things that America will no longer be able to do. The president would talk to the French about tariffs on different products if they didn't permit America to sell our products inside of their own country. This was the serious foreign policy, both military and economic, that our administration understood, and this one simply does not.
Secretary Pompeo, what you said in echoing what I had commented on with respect to the French support for the Allies during the Second World War. You just mentioned something very interesting, and it prompted me to think of an anecdote when you said de Gaulle and the NATO situation when he peeled off from NATO. And I remember very clearly that de Gaulle looked at Secretary of State Dean Rusk, your predecessor under President Kennedy, and said, I want every American troop out of France. And Dean Rusk looked at him and said, even those buried at Normandy?
Yeah.
And he shut his mouth.
So we've operated, Mr. Secretary, in France for a long time, in Europe for a long time now, like literally 27 years. You've got another complication here, and I know you dealt with it as Secretary of State, and that is China and Taiwan. And boy, the saber rattling is for real now. What's your sense of where that is?
There has been enormous escalation of Chinese actual, no BS, physical confrontation surrounding Taiwan, conducting exercises there. Not just the statements, but the reality on the ground, flying more interdictions across the center line of the strait between China and Taiwan. Jay, this is precisely what you get when you appease. You get more threats. You get bolder adversaries. President Biden has demonstrated in Ukraine that he wasn't willing to provide them with the tools for a decisive advantage, and so made the calculation by dribbling out these resources that it would be enough to permit Ukraine to continue to at least hold themselves in a roughly equal position. Xi Jinping's watching that. And so the things you see happening today, not only in and around the Strait of Taiwan, but in the waters off of Japan, in the waters off of Vietnam, efforts in the air, space, and cyber. The Chinese Communist Party is not just, I think it is more than rattling their sabers. I think they are testing this administration to see if there will be a point at which it will respond and push back and actually impose cost on the party itself, on the Chinese Communist Party itself.
We appreciate it as always. Mike Pompeo, of course, former Secretary of State, former director of the CIA, and fortunately for us, Senior Counsel for Global Affairs. Mike, thanks for being with us.